Okay.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to session 2 on balancing profit and people. A deeper dive into the ethics of the pharmaceutical industry by Giordan Ishmael and Sophia Famular. My name is Eliza Locks, and I will be moderating this session. Before we begin, we would like to remind you of some of the important logistical information. Please note that this Zoom session is being video and audio recorded. If you do not grant consent for this, please leave this meeting now. We kindly ask that you mute yourself when you are not speaking as to minimize distractions. We recommend that viewers put the screen in speaker view. If you have questions or comments during the presentation and access to chatting capability, please send them privately to the moderator by selecting them in the to field of the chat box. Students, there may be times throughout the presentation when the presenters will ask for comments from the audience. During these times, you will not use the chat feature. Instead, either please raise your hand in front of the video to indicate that you would like to speak, or come up to the D10 to share. The moderator then will call you by name and room number, at which point you can speak to the presenters and the rest of the group. Please have your phones out and open to the camera app to scan a QR code for later on in the presentation. I will now turn the presentation over to our speakers, Sophia and Giordan. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Yes, so I'm Sophia and
I'm Giordan.
And so we're going to start off with a poll.
So if you could take out your phones and scan this QR code, it will take you to a link where it will ask you a question. And your screen should look like this screenshot right here.
Okay, so we'll give about a, Eliza, if you could check if just once everyone has scanned the code.
Do what?
No, nothing.
It worked for me, so. Oh, no, it says the poll is locked.
Yes, it should say locked.
Oh, okay, great.
We'll unlock it in a second.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for people to scan.
It looks like people are sitting down, so maybe you can unlock it.
Okay. So I will start off the, it'll be a Wordle.
And you can submit as many responses as you'd like.
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
It's still saying locked.
Yeah, it should. I am unlocking it right now.
Okay, awesome.
Okay. Okay, wow, okay, inequality.
Inequality.
Medicine is a big one. Okay, medicine and safety, I see are big. Doctors, Obama.
We have some good words in here though, co-pays.
Yeah, support Medicare rights. Preventative, I suppose. Okay, so I'm going to, so the poll is full. Okay, so that was just to get your mind to think about like what, what's your first response to healthcare and how it should be. So move on.
And then we also have these two questions that we would like you guys to think about, just again to like get you guys to start thinking about our topic. And so the first question is, what do you know about the pharmaceutical industry and how it works?
And then how has the pharmaceutical industry affected you or someone you know? And these are just questions to think about as we're going through our presentation. So we will be doing an ethical analysis of the aspects of the pharmaceutical industry in American society, specifically looking at systems in both advertising and pricing. By looking at these two major parts of pharmaceutical companies, we will attempt to conclude what role pharma companies play in the healthcare industry, specifically how they may be the cause of or contribute to high prices, biased advertising, and other things that could negatively affect quality of healthcare for patients. Further, we will then think about what to do about those potential negative effects on healthcare.
So first, I will be discussing drug pricing. So since the 1960s, pharmaceutical prices have been increasing, and they are predicted to increase even more in the future. This creates a problem because as prices rise, more and more people will struggle to manage the costs. This is potentially hazardous for many people because pharmaceuticals are key to improving and/or saving lives. This chart shows the average drug spending per capita or per person in the United States from 1960 to 2016. The light blue line more accurately represents the price increases over the years, as it includes inflation adjustments, while the dark blue line shows it without. And so with inflation adjustments, prescription drug spending per person has increased from $90 in 1960 to $1,025 in 2016. These spending increases have mostly been credited to the higher drug prices themselves, and not so much so because of a higher rate of sickness or disease within the population or a higher utilization of prescription drugs. So clearly, drug prices are rising, but why? There are a number of factors that have contributed to rising drug prices over the years. And before I explain these causes a bit more in depth, I just wanted to note that pharmaceutical pricing is a very complex topic. And this overview is just a very brief explanation and as to what really goes on. So the first reason is that, like any other business, pharmaceutical companies must generate a profit. To achieve this, they have to exceed their company expenses with the money they generate from their drugs. Company expenses mainly include research and development for a drug, also known as R&D, worker salaries, facilities, taxes, and so on. Drug research and development can prove to be very challenging, especially since some drugs require a tremendous amount of funding to research, develop, produce, and market. In fact, studies have shown that it takes around $1 to $2.6 billion in an average of 12 years to bring a drug to the market. Another factor that influences drug pricing is the size of the market it is competing in, and the price their product is compared to other products. When the market size is smaller, a drug is likely to be more expensive, since there are fewer patients who will pay for the drug and help the drug company make a profit. On the flip side, a larger market allows pharmaceutical companies to have more flexibility when determining their prices, since there are a greater number of patients who can help generate revenue. Drug companies also have to look at competition within their market, if there is any, and compare the cost and effectiveness of their drug to other existing treatments. For example, drug companies may have the incentive to set their drug prices lower in order to beat their competition, who may have higher prices. But if their drug proves to be more valuable than these other treatments, then this may allow them to set their prices higher, since there will be a higher demand for their drug. Next, the price must reflect what pharmaceutical companies have to compensate for other stakeholders in the pharmacy supply chain. Sophia, if you could just click it again. One more time. So when you and I buy prescription medication, can you click it again? Okay, there we go. So when you and I buy prescription medications, we don't buy them directly from the manufacturer, also known as the drug company. Drug companies actually sell their products to other parties like pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, who work for insurance companies, and wholesalers, who then sell the medication to retailers like pharmacies. PBMs and wholesalers require discounts or rebates from the manufacturer. So when drug companies set their prices, they need to keep in mind the discounts that they will need to give to these major purchasers. And so the more discounts and rebates that are given, the more likely pharmaceutical companies are to raise their prices to compensate for the lost money. Lastly, there are patents, which in many cases allow drug companies to maintain market exclusivity. Patents are essential for businesses because they protect a company's research and products and prevent other companies from copying them. However, in many cases, patents allow drug companies to eliminate most, if not all, competition within their market, because patents prevent generic companies from producing generic versions or less expensive versions of a drug. Because of this, drug companies with patents are technically free to raise their prices without the pressure of competition. It is important to note that patents do expire though, but it usually takes about 20 years for them to do so. However, drug companies sometimes try to expand their patented time by obtaining even more patents. The issue with rising prices is that as they continue to go up, the patients and the insurance companies are the main stakeholders who end up absorbing the costs. Most of the time, insurance companies will use methods to manage increasing prices. These methods may include increasing monthly premiums or co-payments for the customers, which occurs when the insurance company and the customer share the cost of the medication. With both these methods, the cost burden is increased for the patient. Insurance companies also have formularies or lists of drugs that they offer to their patients. On formularies, drug companies try to find a balance between generic drugs and drugs with higher consumer demands, which usually include more expensive brand name drugs. By choosing what to cover, insurance companies try and make sure they are not overspending on costly drugs. Sometimes insurance companies rank their drugs on tiers. Drugs ranked on lower tiers are usually generic drugs and require a low copayment, meaning that the patients don't have to pay as much. While drugs on higher tiers require higher copayments, which means patients have to pay more for their medication. Insurance companies will oftentimes force their customers to use drugs on lower tiers before allowing them to use drugs on the higher tiers. Lastly, there is a method called prior authorization, which occurs when patients or their doctors have to seek approval of a prescription in order to gain coverage from the insurance company. In some situations, patients may be denied access to prescribed pharmaceuticals if their insurance company won't cover it as a result of one of the previously mentioned methods, or if they can't pay for it on their own, like if they don't have insurance or enough support from assistance programs. And not receiving the proper medication can lead to overall decreases in patient health. In 2016, a survey showed that 1 out of 7 American adults could not afford to pay for their prescription refills due to the cost. And the likelihood of this increased when adults had 2 or more chronic conditions, meaning that they had more prescriptions to refill. Also, in 2019, one study showed that 1 in 4 adults said they just flat out struggled to pay for their medications. So one example of a drug that has gone through many price increases over the years is Humera, which is a medication that is produced and sold by the company AbbVie. Humera is mainly used to treat rheumatoid arthritis, but it is also used to treat other inflammatory diseases such as Crohn's disease. It was first approved by the FDA and brought to the market in 2002. And since then, the price has drastically risen. Right now, the average price of a 1-month supply of Humera is $8,496, which adds up to well over $100,000 a year. But this cost varies with different insurance companies and assistance programs, and very few patients actually end up paying this cost. Overall, though, patients are finding themselves either directly or indirectly compensating for this high price and for other highly priced medications like this. The red in this graph shows the percentage of the Humera price increase from 2016 to 2019. As you can see, by 2016, the price was already 250% higher than when it was first introduced to the market. Now, the price has increased almost 5-fold. AbbVie has been able to keep increasing its Humera prices because of the market exclusivity they have maintained through patents and agreements. This means that their drug is the only drug of its kind on the market for the main diseases that they treat. Right now, through patents and deals with other generic companies that are also trying to get into the market, AbbVie has obtained market exclusivity until at least 2023. Some even speculate that they will maintain exclusivity until 2034. In 2018, Humera was the top-selling drug in the United States, bringing in a revenue of $13.7 billion. So clearly, their tactics are working to obtain large profit margins. But again, it is ultimately at the expense of the patients.
Okay, so I'm going to show you a clip.
Humera patients, this one's for you. You inspired us to make your Humera experience even better with Humera Citrate Free. It has the same effectiveness you know and trust, but we remove the citrate buffers. There's less liquid and a thinner needle with less pain immediately following injection. Ask your doctor about Humera Citrate Free, and you can use your copay card to pay as little as $5 a month.
Humera can lower your ability to fight infections, serious and sometimes fatal infections, including tuberculosis.
Okay, I wanted to show that ad clip as an example of what we call direct-to-consumer advertising. Now, this is one way that pharmaceutical companies advertise their products. So I just want you to think about what you notice about it, like visual or auditory aspects. All right.
Humera patients.
Okay. And now another poll. And again, this screen on the right here will pop up. It'll say that it's locked, but I'll unlock it when we get to the next slide. I will leave that up for a little longer.
Is this the same poll as last time?
It is not the same, but it'll show up as the same until I activate the next one.
Gotcha.
Okay, I'm gonna move to the poll. And it should activate in a second.
Yeah, you might want to reload your page if you're on it for the audience.
No, it should show up right here. Okay, there are. So how many responses are we getting? Okay, we'll let them file in. Okay, so let's see. Most people thought Canada, and then second, New Zealand, and then, okay, not that many people thought Sweden. So the correct answer is that New Zealand is the only other country in the world that allows direct-to-consumer advertising. So good job if you said New Zealand. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of American direct-to-consumer advertising. So in 1969, the FDA issued advertising regulations that required that drug ads be a true statement of information in brief summary relating to the side effects, contradictions, and effectiveness of drugs. But the 1980s was really when DTC advertising on TV took off. Before then, drugs were primarily advertised to physicians and pharmacists. So this is one form of advertising that comes from pharma companies and goes to the public. However, this is not the only way drug companies advertise their products. There's also direct advertising to physicians. And this is called pharmaceutical detailing. Because this type of advertising is directed to a doctor who is assumed to have advanced medical knowledge, it's usually more scientifically informative than a typical drug ad on TV. So how does it work? Pharmaceutical companies send out what they call detailers to doctors' offices to give a presentation about a newly developed drug in an attempt to both inform the doctor about the drug, but also to persuade them to start prescribing it to patients. So naturally, detailers coming from drug companies will come with a motive of selling their product, that is, increasing prescriptions for the drug they are giving the presentation on. On the other hand, there's another type of detailing called academic detailing. Now, this comes from the government and works essentially the same way as pharmaceutical detailing, with a representative visiting a doctor's office to give a presentation. However, because this presentation is coming from a government representative, it's usually focused more on cost efficiency of drugs, slightly differing from pharmaceutical detailers. Because of this, drugs presented and encouraged by academic detailers may be lower cost drugs, while a pharmaceutical detailer would present about any new drug coming from a drug company. But I also want to note that detailing, both of these types, pharmaceutical and academic, is not the only way that doctors inform themselves about medicine. They may also learn about medicines through medical journals or by attending informational speaker programs held by pharma companies. So let's talk about the policies around detailing and advertising in general. So first, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, a government agency, has certain requirements regarding information shared in ads and in detailing presentations. For direct-to-consumer ads, the FDA only requires the most severe and common side effects to be listed. Now, this is not to say that the FDA encourages untruthfulness. In fact, by FDA policy, any promotional information shared about drugs is required to be a true statement of information in brief summary relating to the side effects, contradictions, and effectiveness. I'm merely pointing out that there's still room for improvement of these policies. For example, requiring all side effects be listed as opposed to only the most severe and common ones. There are also some aspects of drug ads that were suggested, not required. For example, the popular phrase, "ask your doctor," heard at the end of most modern drug ads. That was actually outlined when PhRMA, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, issued their guiding principles for direct-to-consumer advertisements about prescription drugs in 2005. So PhRMA code is a voluntary code of behavior that many drug companies choose to follow. It's a legal requirement in some states, but it's not a federal requirement. Other guidelines of PhRMA code include the occasional provision of a gift that meets certain criteria and has a value of less than $100 when talking about a detailing visit. And the code also prohibits lavish meals or meals at an extravagant venue. Usually detailing visits are held at doctors' offices. However, with the start of the pandemic, most detailing encounters are virtual now. Now, I wanted to mention an example of a real crisis that happened not too long ago, the opioid crisis. So let me start by saying that the events that led up to the opioid crisis were in violation of advertising and promotional policies set forth by the FDA and PhRMA. This is not an example of a bad outcome of legal conduct, it's a bad outcome of illegal conduct. So that being said, I'd like to point it out still because I feel it sets forth the extreme situation that our inquiry is working to prevent by being skeptical about slight gaps in policies that could create loopholes that could lead to crises. So in 2015, there were 300 million prescriptions of opioids, a stark increase from previous years. 1 in 12 doctors were paid by opioid pharma companies, and so that's about 8.3% of doctors. And opioids have claimed 175,000 lives from 1999 to 2013. So the opioid crisis is an extreme example of when a pharma company engages in activity that goes well beyond the guidelines set forth for drug advertising. Again, this was illegal. But I think it stresses the importance of continually being observant of pharmaceutical companies to make sure that they continue to strictly follow guidelines that were created to keep them from falling too far into profit-driven actions at the expense of patients' health.
So in our ethical evaluation, we will be exploring the values of responsibility and autonomy, as well as the ethical principle of utilitarianism.
So our main ethical question is, why should the pharmaceutical industry be treated or regulated differently in comparison to other industries? And so by other industries, we mean other industries that have a stake in advertising and pricing. So industries that provide useful products to consumers that they promote using salespeople and that they price using complex and confidential methods.
So one reason why pharmaceutical companies should be treated differently is because they have a major responsibility to their patients, and more specifically to their patients having access to the proper medications. This means that pharmaceutical companies have the responsibility to price their products so that widespread access can be achieved. A drug company also has an obligation to be beneficent because they are a vital part of the healthcare system and are key in helping physicians treat their patients. Because of this, drug companies need to make sure they are continuously prioritizing their customers and maintaining the mindset of doing good for others. Now, one might argue that those who do work for pharmaceutical companies already have very good intentions to aid public health, as this is the whole purpose of the industry. But though they may have these good intentions, it does not always seem to translate into practice. Through my research, I have found that their good intentions can sometimes get lost or skewed in the pursuance of large profit margins, and in some cases, personal gain. It is important for drug makers to properly balance both of these ideals by realistically setting their drug prices so that people don't end up struggling or making ends meet to pay for their prescription costs.
So I want to start by the Hippocratic Oath, which is an oath that all physicians swear to be beneficent and look out for their patients' interest. Doctors have a responsibility to look out for their patients' interests. So because the mindset of a pharma detailer is to both inform but also tailor their presentation to a physician's needs, there will automatically be an advertisement-like bias in order to convince the doctor to prescribe certain drugs. So doctors can be paid directly by drug companies to speak or present at educational events about certain drugs. And both of these are coming from drug companies, so their goal will be to convince and inform. Then there's the academic detailing, which is typically sponsored or conducted by government agencies or academic medical centers. An academic detailer will usually present lower cost drugs. And this is unsurprising because the government's job is to provide the public with health care. So making it more cost efficient and thus accessible would align with that responsibility. But how will these different parties and their different biases affect the doctor's ability to uphold their responsibility to the patient by making an entirely objective prescription? It's hard to be objective when the information you receive may be biased.
So next, we looked at the principle of autonomy, or the lack thereof. So with the pharmaceutical industry and in comparison to other consumer markets, patients do not have complete autonomy when it comes to the selection and payment of prescription drugs. So with another industry, for example, like when a person wants to buy a car, they are able to choose which car they want based on its qualities, what it looks like, and most importantly, the cost. People may also go to dealerships and consult with professionals to decide which car is best for them. However, at the end of the day, the customer has the ultimate decision to buy the car or not. The difference in the pharmaceutical market is that the patient must accept the price of their medications. This is because patients are not the sole decision maker, as many of the decisions are being made for them. So for example, the pharmaceutical companies mainly control the prices and they have major influence over the drug prices, while the physician prescribes the medication. And for those with insurance, the insurance companies choose whether or not to cover the costs and how much of it to cover. So like I said, many of the decisions are already being made for them. And if patients choose not to pay for their prescriptions, then they may have to face the health consequences of not taking the proper medications. So does this seem fair to the patient? And should the system work this way? Now, it would be hard and not very realistic for the patients to become the sole decision maker, as lots of prior knowledge and expertise is needed to aid the patient in their medical decisions. But ultimately, if the system was altered to give the patient a bit more autonomy, then it may make the situation more ethical, since they would have more control over what they choose to pay for based on what they can afford.
So patients with detailing. So detailing informs doctors of drugs who then prescribe them to patients. There's no direct patient to company contact. So when talking about specifically detailing, there might be less patient autonomy. Further, the learned intermediary doctrine is a legal guideline that essentially states that only doctors or prescribers need to be fully informed of side effects of drugs and are then trusted to relay that information to their patients, leaving it to the doctor to determine which side effects are important and which aren't, removing the patient's autonomy of knowing what's best for themselves. So further, in direct-to-consumer ads, the FDA only requires the most common and severe side effects to be listed. So this is more transparent than leaving it up to the doctor totally, but in a sense, this is still not providing a patient with full autonomy because they are not completely informed without knowing all the side effects of a drug. So that's not to say that a patient may not read about drugs online or go to their pharmacist and ask questions about certain prescription drugs. However, that leaves that decision whether to be informed up to the patient as opposed to guaranteeing that they are fully informed, and thus doesn't really ensure patient autonomy. So another question to think about is, should drug companies place a greater emphasis on balancing profit with promotion, pricing, and patient access? So by profit, we mean generating money in excess of what's needed to keep the company going to fund further innovations. Promotion, that the sense that companies are trying to target audiences and sell, and pricing, that companies can accurately price their drugs to ensure widespread access to them. A constant struggle to balance all three of these, but ultimately we believe that proper promotion and pricing should be prioritized over profit, as this will work towards helping patients have access to and receive the best care possible. However, one must also keep in mind that drug companies have a responsibility to make people at their company a profit, and so that they can distribute it to people like employees or major shareholders. So where does that leave us? What should we do?
So in our argument, we have identified a slippery slope. And so a slippery slope basically means that one decision leads to another and keeps leading to other decisions until a situation becomes either wrong or disastrous. So if we state that there should be more or different regulations within the pharmaceutical industry, then to what extent should there be that regulation? And so though the industry is currently regulated, pharmaceutical companies are still technically competing in a free market space. So should it be this way? Because their products are essential to the public, is it ethical that their products are competing in a free market space where access is not guaranteed? And also, what other industries serve the public good? And should these industries also be treated differently or have increased regulations, like what we are proposing for the pharmaceutical industry? We also looked at our argument through the lens of utilitarianism. And so utilitarianism means looking for a solution that provides the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people. So when looking at regulating the pharmaceutical industry through a utilitarian lens, we have identified a short-term negative effect and a long-term benefit of the current circumstances of the industry. So in the short term, higher drug prices mean that pharmaceutical companies make more money. But as I mentioned before, higher prices will also lead to less patient access. Therefore, this does not reflect the greatest good for greatest number of people ideal, since high drug prices do not benefit the majority of the population or the patients.
But looking at long-term utilitarianism, the opposite argument could be made. So if no more regulations are put in place, then pharmaceutical companies continue to make substantial profits. One must remember that developing and releasing drugs is highly expensive. So if companies continue to make a profit, more profit than they already have, then they will have more money to spend on clinical trials and development, which in the future will lead to more and better medicine despite the short-term effect.
So one major solution to treating the pharmaceutical industry differently is to increase government regulation. For pricing, this could potentially include establishing national price negotiations, where the government must approve of a drug before it enters the market, of a drug's price before it enters the market. The government could also alter patent laws, which could potentially affect market exclusivity and increase competition. There could also be rules and regulations put in place with the goal of increasing transparency between stakeholders and the pharmaceutical industry, so patients and other stakeholders are better informed about the cost of medications. In the long run, this could incentivize more competition, as stakeholders would want to seek out the lowest available prices.
And through the lens of advertising and how that influences prescribing, the potential solution or goal is to increase transparency about practices. It's still the case that most individuals do not know about pharmaceutical detailing or even that it exists. So spreading general awareness is important. It is also important to know that progress is being made to increase awareness and understanding of how pharmaceutical companies interact with healthcare professionals. So for example, in 2014, under the Physicians Payment Sunshine Act, which is under the Affordable Care Act, payments from pharmaceutical companies to doctors are required to be public. So nowadays it's easily accessible online by using something like ProPublica, a website, or a government website. So just knowing more about the pharma companies will lessen the bias and impact because patients will have the ability to advocate for themselves just by knowing about these practices, and they'll have more autonomy.
So next we created 2 hypothetical situations that we want all of you to think about and possibly decide what you would do in these scenarios. So the first scenario is to imagine that you are the CEO of a startup pharmaceutical company. Your new company decides to take a huge risk and spends $2 billion developing a treatment for a rare disease that affects, let's say, 1 in 7,000 people. After years of hard work, your company has finally successfully brought this treatment to the market. Now you must determine the price of the treatment. Your price will need to be high enough to generate a profit and cover the tremendous costs that went into researching, developing, and producing your product. You must also make sure that your company has enough money to run and fund future projects, and that you can satisfy your shareholders and investors with business growth. If you had complete freedom with pricing, how high would you price your drug? $100, $1,000, $1 million? You should think about how your choices will affect your patients. A higher price means that they may possibly struggle to pay for it. To what extent would you place this burden on them for the pursuit of profit?
And then we also have a hypothetical situation in the point of view of a doctor. So imagine you are a physician caring for a patient who needs a blood thinner. You have been informed of numerous drugs that may work. You've heard from pharmaceutical companies and academic detailers. And some companies have invited you to speak at educational conferences and paid you. All of the potential drugs serve the same basic FDA-approved function. To simplify it, let's narrow it down to a choice between a drug company who has paid you and one who has not. Which one would you prescribe? And now let's say that there are more side effects from the drug coming from the company who paid you. Which one would you prescribe? Would you prescribe the drug that would benefit you but has more side effects, or a drug that does nothing for you but has less side effects? Let's keep in mind that side effects are not definite, so the patient may or may not have them. What would you do as the patient's physician?
And here are just some further questions for you to just keep thinking about. The first one being, how much responsibility do you think pharmaceutical companies have with regards to patient access and health?
And the second being, how do we balance good intent with the reality of a complicated world where ethicality may not always translate in practice? Thank you. Okay, and we can go back to some of those questions or hypotheticals if it comes up in the discussion.
Okay. So thank you guys so much for sharing the presentation. I personally learned a lot. So now we have a little bit of time for Q&A. So if you have a question or comment, please feel free to raise your hand and I will come up to the D10 and I can call on you. If you're a remote viewer, you can also contact me in the chat box and I can read your question out loud. If you just type in moderator, you can send a message directly to me. So any starting questions? I can't see anyone. Maybe if you're on the D10. Oh, I see someone moving. Okay, Gabby, go ahead.
Hey, Liza. So a quick question. So for the Hippocratic Oath, how does that kind of, from the doctor's, perspective of which drug to choose, does the Hippocratic Oath ever, have a deciding say in the decision that a doctor can make, or is it very free from the doctor's perspective for which drug they would rather endorse?
Well, so the Hippocratic Oath it's like an ancient oath. It's been remade, and it's kind of, I mean, that's just as a doctor to maintain that, like, always think about your patient's interests. So honestly, in that hypothetical situation, I probably would have chosen the drug with less side effects, but less payment for the physician, because that's more in line with the Hippocratic Oath. But it's not, I wouldn't say it's like enforced. It doesn't really, it's not like a deciding factor.
Ms. Dwyer?
All right. So earlier in the presentation, you were talking about the way in which direct-to-consumer advertising really exploded in the 80s. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what it was happening in the 80s that really brought that about.
I hand it down, I think.
Technology, I would assume, but it's been up and down. I did know there were some times where the FDA kind of put indirect, like not formal bans on DTC advertising. But I'd probably just say the rise of technology.
Haley, do you have one?
Reaching, sorry.
Oh, sorry,
one more
Sophia.
thing, but
Do you
also
want to finish the
reaching
question?
the public became more of a, like, they saw that they could do it through TV, as opposed to just in magazines. I guess also just what the public was starting to see.
Okay, Haley, go ahead.
First off, great presentation, guys. Congratulations. We were, oh yeah. We were wondering why you guys chose to investigate those specific topics. Like, what piqued your interest about it?
Well, for me, it was actually my dad, since he read this book about like how the healthcare system and rising pharmaceuticals, and then this ethics, I learned about the ethics topic for this year, and I kind of like put two and two together and thought, oh, well, this could be pretty cool. Yeah.
And for me, it was my grandma. So I wanted to do something like, I don't know, we were always just kind of wondering about why, like if a drug prescription was changed or just any decision made by a doctor. I was wondering, well, why, like what's going on, like that we're not listening to. So I wanted to look into that, and I found out about detailing.
I think it's really cool that you guys both have somewhat personal connections to the topics. I would be really curious to see what that book is, Giordan. But okay, we have only 10 more minutes until we go back to the main session. So technically I'm supposed to let you go around now. We might be pushing things back a little bit since we started late. I don't know, Miss Crow, are we pushing things back or are we still ending now?
The closing will begin at 11:35.
Okay, so I should probably let you guys go. Thank you so much. And here I can drop the link for the closing remarks so that it's easier to find. Give me 1 second.